Okay, so here we are again with another video from Mr. Bouchard's IB history class. We are going to move into a very exciting topic, one of my favorites, and we're just going to kind of just do some background right now and go over kind of some of the major events that happened at the beginning of the what is termed as the Cold War. In 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies that had just defeated Germany and working on the defeat of Japan. By 1947, they engaged in a diplomatic and economic confrontation that one U.S. businessman and advisor to Harry Truman termed the phrase the Cold War. Why? They had convergent security concerns. During our simulation today, I think one of the major things you can see is that the Soviets saw security in terms of space, given their history of being invaded. They've been invaded by Germany 2 major times, been invaded by France, and in each time there was major Soviet casualties or major Russian casualties. So the German buffer zone was crucial for Stalin and the Soviets. Whereas the Americans, on the other hand, had tended to see security in institutional terms. Given their history, they assumed representative governments should be established everywhere possible, which would help create collective security. This was not obviously not solvable. They had ideological differences as well. Soviet communism was feared by the West. Stalin downplayed it during the war, but his rhetoric after the war called for a renewed commitment to world revolution. Yet we know now that Stalin thought it was most important to preserve the Soviet Union rather than support revolution in other places. The United States pushed the Soviet Union to get political concessions in Eastern Europe and other places if they wanted to receive a large loan to help benefit the Soviet Union. So we're going to just take a look at the U.S. actions as we try and figure out who's responsible for this Cold War. The U.S. early on in 1945 surrounded the Soviet Union with U.S. air and naval bases. They restricted the Soviet naval access to the Mediterranean Sea. One of the major goals of the Soviets was to be able to have ports in the Black Sea, control the straits, and then be able to navigate and have control of the Mediterranean. And the U.S. was obviously not very forthcoming there. They had U.S. bases were being put around across the globe, and the Soviets, I think, saw this as American aggression. Rapid deployment of U.S. and allied troops to Korea, China, Manchuria to prevent communist penetration, to keep to keep South Korea free, terminated aid to the Soviets, but then offered it with a lot of strings attached. The use of the atomic bomb, refused to share the technology. They came up with the Baruch Plan, which would allow the UN to oversee all atomic activity, but the U.S. would not give over their bombs, and the Soviet Union would not submit to inspections. And so basically by refusing to give up their bombs, refusing to give the technology out, it pushed the Soviets, and the Soviets felt like they had to go get an atomic bomb, which is really one of the cruxes of the idea of the Cold War, because one of the ideas that the United States and the Soviet Union never fought was because of the fear of nuclear weapons. The use of atomic bomb, talked about that. So the refusals to give atomic secrets to the Soviets guarantee an arms race, and excluded the Soviets from Japan. The Soviets refused to allow elections in any place they had taken control with their military, and Stalin's rhetoric about inevitability of a conflict, his rhetoric that the world revolution, and we'll see the following quote: "In course of further development of international revolution, there will emerge 2 centers of world significance. A socialist center drawing to itself the countries which tend toward socialism, and a capitalist center drawing to itself the countries that incline towards capitalism. Battle between these 2 centers for command of the world economy will decide the fate of capitalism and of communism in the entire world." And so this is Stalin's really idea that there is no coexistence, and this is the type of rhetoric he was using. And so we could look and say, hey, maybe this is really was the Soviets and this Stalin's rhetoric, despite the fact that he was just worried about the Soviet Union surviving. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of the events that happen around the world here, and then I'm just going to talk about them to kind of set us up as we move forward. So the first thing is the United Nations. The United Nations was with the Soviet Union, and they needed to get the Soviet Union on board first. And so what the Soviet Union wanted is they wanted a couple things. One is they did not want, they wanted everybody, basically the major allies, France, Great Britain, Soviet Union, United States, and China would all sit on would be permanent members of the Security Council, and if they vetoed any actions by the United Nations, then the United Nations wouldn't be able to do anything. Stalin also worked against the International Bank, and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The U.S. created both of these to help facilitate trade, rebuilding, and then later on offer loans to developing countries. But a lot of these were to help Europe, specifically Western Europe, rebuild and become a lot stronger. And so a couple of things that as we look at this world map, and obviously this world map is a little bit different. This would all be the Soviet Union, split this would all be communist nations, and then this would all be the Soviet Union. There would be no Ukraine, there would be no Kazakhstan and these other countries. It would just be part of the Soviet Union in here. So, one of the first events is the Iron Curtain speech, and we're going to get a chance to read that tomorrow. And the Iron Curtain speech really is Winston Churchill speaking at a commencement speech for college graduates in Missouri. Basically comes out and really says that America needs to fight against, or needs to stand strong against the Soviets. That the Soviets are going to drop an Iron Curtain over Eastern Europe, and they will not allow any type of freedom or trade, and that the United States, because now Great Britain is no longer what it was, and this is when he is no longer Prime Minister, but he says that Great Britain can't take the lead, and that the U.S. needs to take the lead and push against the Soviets. He calls for a tough approach towards the aggressive Soviet policies that he expected to come in the future. So it's not on the map here, but you can go ahead and put it right in here. Okay, just go ahead and add that right in this area or in your notes because you don't have a map at this point. But 1946, 1947, Soviets supported communist revolutions in Romania, Bulgaria, and other coup attempts. But they also backed out of Iran, left China, and did not protest U.S. control of Japan. But we can see already in 1946 and 47 that the communists are going out, and the Soviets are really doing what they said, or really put forward in their security concerns in our conference. But we can see that their major security concern was to have a buffer between them and Germany. And so they wanted this whole area to be communist, okay? And they supported revolutions in these areas. And then Germany was split in half. And that is part of what they were moving forward with. Now, the next thing here is the Truman Doctrine, or what is considered the Truman Doctrine. It was a speech about Turkey and Greece. Truman and his advisors acted decisively. Britain could no longer support Greece and Turkey. And if you notice that Greece and Turkey are right here, okay? And this is the Black Sea right here. And so Russia wanted a warm water port. And that would allow, they wanted to control these straits right here that would allow them to come out in the Mediterranean trade, because all this freezes over, and that really prevents a lot of Soviet trade into Europe and into the new hemisphere. I mean, they can go this way, and there's some warm water ports here, but most of the population is right here. And so to have a warm water port in the Black Sea would be very good for the Soviet Union. And so they really wanted that. And if Turkey and Greece both turned communist, that would give them control of this. And so that's really what they were pushing for at the end of World War II. It's one of the things they wanted. But Truman basically announces that he is giving $400 million to Turkey and Greece in military and financial aid to help defeat the communist revolutions there. The United States saw not people from Turkey and Greece who might want something like communism, or were nationalists trying to overthrow the government so that more people would get the wealth within the countries. They saw it as that the Soviet Union was masterminding these revolutions here, and that these countries would then would wind up turning to communism. And so this is really Truman's doctrine, which becomes this idea of containment, that wherever communism is fine, but it cannot expand and should not expand, and that the United States needs to do everything and spend whatever they need to keep communism from expanding. And that brings us to the Marshall Plan in 1947. On May 1947, at a Harvard commencement speech, Secretary of State George Marshall, who used to be General Marshall, described at great length the harsh social and economic conditions that existed, which came from Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson. Europe is steadily deteriorating, millions starving, without further and substantial aid from the U.S. 1946, Europe imported $4.4 billion in goods from the U.S., but the U.S. only imported $900 million back from Europe. And so that's a huge trade imbalance. And so Europe needs a lot of assistance. So by 1947, European countries were recovering, but a lot because of the U.S. gifts of food and fuel. So the United States decides to launch the European Recovery Plan, which is often called the Marshall Plan, and it's $12 billion in grants to Western nations. Now, the reason it was to Western nations, it was to any nation, but the strings attached was that you had to be a country that held elections, and that you had to throw off any type of idea of communism. So what happens is that the U.S. gives this needed free states for both help in military strength and trading partners. The United States knows that the more trading partners and the more countries that are democratic, the better off they're going to be. So the idea of building up France and Western Germany and all of the different nations in the Western Hemisphere, or the western part of Europe, would then create strong economies that the U.S. could then trade with, and it would also kind of marginalize socialism, marginalize the communist threat in Western Europe, and that's exactly the effect that it had. What role did the Soviets play? The U.S. offered it to them, and the Soviets considered it, but then rejected it, because the Soviets really wanted a large grant from the United States, but the U.S. would only give it to them within the context of the Marshall Plan, and so that would put a lot of strings attached, and so the Soviets then rejected it, and after initial encouragement to other satellite states, they told them to reject it as well. And the Soviets returned with what they call the Comintern Pact, or otherwise known as the Molotov Pact, which was the Soviet assistance to their satellite nations, and that's what we consider Eastern Europe. The issue here, though, for the Soviets is that they were decimated at the end of the war. Their country was in ruins, and so they were not in a place where the United States came out of World War II, a booming economy. They had the GI plan, and so they sent all these people to get extra training, and so the economy just grew exponentially during the 40s and 50s. And so the United States was in a place where it really could help people, and that wasn't necessarily the case. Okay, so this is the Marshall Plan. Whatever the weather, we must move together, with the idea that these nations were all part of the Marshall Plan. So in 1948, we have the OAS, and this is the Organization of American States. We're going to talk about this in concert with the idea of, well, we'll talk about it. We're going to put this in here, and then we'll come back to that. But the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 1949. So both of these are treaty organizations where the United States takes a wholly different look at, or a different way of approaching the U.S. So basically, the United States creates a situation where now it is going to have pacts with both the American states and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that says if one is attacked, we are all attacked. And so NATO creates defense positions all throughout Europe, up in these areas right here, because of the Soviet threat. The OAS also talks about the threat of communism and works against communism. And then the United States creates an African organization, an Eastern Asian association of states to work against the spread of communism, which, as you can see, would be a threat to the Soviets. And so the Soviets respond with the Molotov Pact, and they create a situation where they all come in to a pact saying that we will all help each other militarily against any threat from the West. During this time, there was also the National Security Act. It was passed in 1947, which created the CIA and the National Security Council. The CIA would handle intelligence gathering and covert operations, and the National Security Council assembled top diplomatic and military advisors into one committee. And both of these groups really work against communism. And so the creation of the CIA is an important part as we're looking forward to going on. So I have one more thing to talk about, and then we're going to cap off our thing here. All right, so the last thing we need to talk about is the Berlin airlift in 1948. And as you can see, here's some boys that are cheering U.S. planes flying into West Berlin. One of the things when we look at Germany is that Germany was split down here, but Berlin is clearly in the Eastern zone. It is clearly in the Soviet zone. But the United States had occupied Berlin because that was the capital, and they, the Allies, basically Canada, Great Britain, France, all had half of Berlin, and the Soviets had the other half. And so basically they split Berlin down the middle. Well, with this idea of containment, that communism cannot be anywhere where it shouldn't be, the United States was not going to let go of Berlin. But the Soviets were upset. They wanted to force the Western powers to leave Berlin because they were behind the Soviet zone. They didn't like that. Above all else, the Soviets wanted to prevent West Berlin from becoming part of the newly proposed West German state because they feared that the Western powers might place U.S. atomic weapons in West Berlin, right next door to Soviet-controlled territory. And you can see that this is a fear that they had, and in a lot of ways, it's a large fear, and you can see why they didn't want this to happen. So the Soviets, basically, this whole thing started around this disagreement on currency. The United States put a new currency that had been secretly printed in the U.S. Mint, released that currency, and the Soviet officials immediately rejected the new currency and moved that day to close off all automobile, rail, and water traffic into Berlin. So basically they said, if you're going to do this new currency, you didn't talk to us, we're going to create our own currency, but we're going to cut you off. We're not going to allow you into Berlin. And all the electricity that was going into West Berlin, the Allied-controlled area of Berlin, was also coming from the eastern sector. It was coming from coal plants that were in East Germany. And so basically, they cut off all coal-generated electricity supplied for East Germany to Berlin sectors. Land and water routes from West Germany into Berlin were closed. The 2.3 million Berliners living in western sectors of the city, as well as the military personnel stationed there, were marooned within the Soviet-controlled territory. A total blockade was in place. So what did the Allies do? They basically did a massive airlift organized by Western powers. They carried coal, they carried food, they carried everything they could into West Germany. Ernest Reuter, who was the mayor, a German anti-communist who had been elected mayor of West Berlin in 1948, announced that Western Berliners would tighten their belts and make do with whatever supplies they received. And the airlift began on June 26, when American C-47s flew 80 tons of food into West Berlin. The tonnage was a tiny percentage of what would be needed daily, but the operation was underway. And on June 28th, the U.S. Air Force ordered larger, faster planes called C-54s from Alaska, Hawaii, and the Caribbean to aid in the airlift. The RAF flew Dakotas similar to the C-47s for their part of the airlift, and the RAF also pressed private commercial air carriers into service. Air crews from Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa to fly the missions. So the United States nicknamed the airlift Operation Vittles, and the British dubbed the effort Operation Plain Fare. At first, and so the United States basically denied the Soviets West Berlin in this effort to create a basically this idea that they were not going to give in. They were not going to give in. They were not going to allow communism to expand. So that's the basically the first kind of background to some of this. We're going to look at the historian's views and some primary sources as we move forward the next couple of days. Thank you, and I hope you